And we are live. Everybody, welcome to a very, very special stream that we have for you all tonight. We're going to be talking about all things Deuterocanonical. Indeed, we're going to be talking about, is there any kind of prophecy, any kind of foreshadowing of the Holy Eucharist in the Deuterocanon? I bet it's really a topic you maybe have never heard of. And to talk about that, I am with my brother, my good brother Gary, and my dear friend, the incredible Father Coppins. How are you all doing this evening?
Doing well.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm doing fine.
Wonderful. Yeah, I've got to admit, this is really a fascinating topic, and I'm going to share my screen because I'm aware that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be digging deep into Scripture. A lot of people are not aware that when you look in the Deuterocanon, and I know we're going to be digging into the Book of Wisdom. We're going to be looking at the Book of Sirach, Baruch. A lot of books that ring really near and dear to the hearts of Catholics, Orthodox, and what have you. Our separated brethren really it's kind of a bit of an anomaly to them. They kind of really don't know much about them. That is why I think it's very helpful to kind of maybe in keeping in tune with the very book that Father Coppins and myself put out, calling pulling the veil back, kind of pulling that veil back and really inviting Protestants and other people that really aren't aware of these books to kind of dig in. And there you go, Gary showing a picture of the book right there.
There you go.
To kind of dig in. Would you say that we have some pretty incredible texts in the Deuterocanon that kind of give us unique insights into this topic, Father?
Yeah, well, of course, in the book, which I see as your background, we were not entirely surprised that manna would be in the scriptures. Obviously, Jesus himself refers to himself as the bread that came down from heaven. But some of the surprising references to manna do come in late books of scripture. For example, in Wisdom, we see some references to manna in Baruch, as you mentioned, as well as some interesting meteorological phenomena in the book of Sirach, which also help us understand what's happening with a lot of this manna talk. So, yeah, the Deuterocanonicals form a link between the older books, meaning the more remotely written books of the Old Testament, and the New Testament, because these are the kind of books. In fact, not too long ago, I think through you, William, I sent a study to Gary on synagogue readings, the reading cycle in the synagogue. You may remember that article, Gary.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And what's kind of interesting is we're probably very aware that the Jewish people regularly read at their synagogue liturgies, at their synagogue services, the law, and they tended to read that straight through. The prophets, which was let's call it their second reading. But what we sometimes fail to realize is a lot of the Deuterocanonical material was not read at synagogue, but used for the homilizing at synagogue. And so what it seems like the Deuterocanonical material, as well as some of the other non-prophetical Old Testament material was used for, was a point of reference to understand the older material. So what we have in the New Testament is something similar. The New Testament is material which is commenting on the oldest material and commenting on the intermediate material. The intermediate material, the Deuterocanon, is commenting on the oldest material. And all of it is concerned, among other things, with manna.
Yeah, really, really good points you make there, Father. And there is one particular area where it really does stick out to me. We go to the Book of Wisdom, chapter 7. And I'm going to go ahead and read it for the audience. Wisdom 7, 15, 17, and 20. It says, "And God hath given me to speak as I would, and to conceive thoughts worthy of those things that are given me, because he is the guide of wisdom and the director of the wise. For he hath given me the true knowledge of the things that are, to know the disposition of the whole world and the virtues of the elements." Verse 20, "The natures of living creatures and rage of wild beasts, the force of winds, the reasonings of men, the diversities of plants, and the virtues of roots. Now, when I look at that, maybe people don't, nothing really does stick out at them, but as we're building the case and going forward and forward, what exactly do we have here, Father, when we read of virtues of elements, natures of living creatures? Is there any kind of implication that we find in the Book of Wisdom that will maybe help us understand what we're talking about in the Holy Eucharist once we come to the New Testament and the patristic era?
Well, this whole idea of natures is not something that most of us are used to hearing. We hear nature. So there's mother nature, which is a common phrase, or what is the nature of this or that element. And we tend to think that nature might mean something like the natural world, or if we ask for the nature of an element or the nature of the dog versus a cat nature or human nature. We're starting to get a little bit closer when we talk about human nature and cat nature and dog nature, because we're starting to talk about what activities are normal for being a cat, maybe mewing and ignoring you and doing whatever it wants and sleeping all day. So, and then we think about dog nature, and that's probably fetching things, and we start to list all these sorts of activities, and we're starting to get a closer sense in English of exactly what the Book of Wisdom means by nature. We should remember that the Book of Wisdom itself is taking its point of departure on talking about natural elements and their natures from earlier discussions. So the Book of Wisdom is really expounding on things like Exodus 7. Exodus 7 wants to talk about the fact that water has a nature and blood has a nature, and the Nile River was changed from water, which seems to be clear, it's potable, drinkable. It tends to be life-giving, life-preserving, and it's changed to this other stuff, which is blood, which is of an entirely different activity with different operations and different ways of manifesting itself, red versus white, etc. And these things may seem basic to us, but this was the best talk, the most scientific talk of the time when we talk about natures. And so the Book of Wisdom is explaining that when one kind of object, A, water, becomes another kind of object, B, blood, that its activities change, which show that what underlies it changes. That is, the basic stuff that it is changes. It's no longer water because it's red. It's no longer water because it looks like it's thicker. It's no longer water because it has the taste of blood instead of the taste of water. And so all these external activities show that there's an underlying change in what the thing is. And so in Wisdom 7:15 through 20, what we're seeing here is a description of the world that is made out of basic elements. Now, you and I know that there's the periodic chart, and no matter how many times I count the most recent number of elements, we filled them all in. I can't remember the exact number, but let's put it, somewhere around 100. And when the ancient world, you were dealing with a debate, not if there was 100 elements, but really if there was a debate between 4 or 5 elements. And earth, wind, fire, and water were kind of considered the basic structures of things. We don't really have an adoption of that in any sort of dogmatic sense in the Bible, but what we do have is the sense that there's basic stuff in the world where our writers are probably assuming that their readers think of the 4 elements. But what they do believe in is they believe that there are basic kinds of beings in the universe, like we call atoms, iron atoms and tin. There's all kinds of different atoms out there that we tend to think of as products, like metals or rocks. And these things have their own natures. And what is being said here then is that the structure of the world, every single kind of element has its own very peculiar structure, which means it can't be mistaken for another kind of element normally. And even animals and plants are distinguished by their own structures. And of course, what is biology nowadays, or what is any of the kinds of sciences like geology, but trying to distinguish the different kinds of structures and to compare and contrast them in order to create charts of how they relate to one another or their hierarchies and these sorts of things. This is exactly what wisdom is doing, but wisdom is basically developing the ideas that you find, especially, for example, in Exodus, that there are certain kinds of things with certain kind of activities, and they can be miraculously changed or transformed by God.
That really is really incredible. And to kind of toss it to you, Gary, I wonder what your thoughts are, because when I look at, and indeed for the audience, we're building up, we're going to get to some pretty mind-blowing tips in a moment, but doesn't it lend credence to the fact that just like the proto-canonical texts in the Old Testament, we really have an incredible kind of theology laid out for us, Gary, that it doesn't, rather, as some people mistakenly think, the Deuterocanon doesn't feel disconnected from any of the proto-canon, but rather flows perfectly. What are your thoughts on that, Gary?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's virtually indistinguishable from the proto-canon. And like Father laid out, this whole idea of the basic elements. And of course, in the Book of Wisdom, it's the reason why Solomon knew all this is because he obtained wisdom through prayer, right? So since wisdom created all things, through wisdom, he can know these, the features of the earth and so on. And, but that's a really important point though, Father, about that God can change these elements, the properties of water to the properties of blood. I think I'll just leave it there. I don't want to go into.
Well, one of the strongest arguments in the patristic lexicon or the patristic repertoire of things to say, Gary, is a lot of people out there can be dubious of miracles because they sound too incredible. So, for example, one miracle that bothers a lot of people for some reason might be that Mary remained physically somehow unscarred or integral in the act of giving birth. And the old phrase that was used by the fathers was, Mary was a virgin before birth, in birth, and after birth, meaning that she was a perpetual virgin, and that somehow, like Jesus passing through the closed doors without obviously busting through them in the upper room, that when Jesus was born, he was born in some miraculous way. And our initial reactions to sort of step back and say, no, that miracle sounds too weird to me or too odd. I don't think I'm going to accept that one. The fathers noted immediately, actually, you're probably not noticing that you're betraying some rather fundamental principles. The fundamental principles are, if we all admit that there was a cause of the universe, and the universe before it was caused, there was nothing, and this means there was a vacuum. There was absolutely darkness, sort of like my screen, I suppose. And God created something. And philosophically speaking, it's much harder when you have no pre-existent stuff to make something to argue that a God can create out of nothing. Not that nothing is some sort of product. Nothing is the absence of anything. Mm-hmm. So that there is nothing and God creates is a much harder argument, which most of us accept if we're already Christians or theists, than the argument that God can take already existing matter and do something quite extraordinary with it. What's also interesting is those of us who have kind of doubts about the extent to which God can do miracles, some of these things we're led to believe in atheistic materialism aren't miracles at all. So if I can get DNA out of basically elements which somehow self-organize and come alive, then why is it so weird to believe that God can take bread and wine and change it into something that it's not? It seems to me that it's much harder to show how you can have material that doesn't seem to have any living properties and that abiogenesis, it comes alive by itself. We can stick this material in a tank. So a scientist would tell us, we know exactly or pretty precisely what the billions of years ago, what the surface of the earth looked like. It was pretty darn inhospitable. And it had all these odd conditions that just by chance, something on its own, though we can't repeat it in an experiment, sprang to life. And you know what? We can actually provide in a little box better conditions that existed then, supreme conditions, which life should just be, popping up everywhere in our little black box. And we can throw in all the so-called electrical impulses and all the kind of non-organic matter that we want in there in the best of all possible combinations, and we get nothing. And yet, at the same time, we shirk from the idea of miracles. I think that really the scientific community and sometimes the religious community, it's just a question of whose miracles are slightly more difficult to believe in. And so in the end here, then, the fathers are going to argue that God can change elements because he's the creator of elements. It's a harder thing to create them than it is to remake them into something else. And hence, it's actually easier for God philosophically to take already existing matter and to make it in a different kind of matter than it is to have nothing and to make matter.
Really, really good points that you make there, Father. And I think that when we kind of recognize that language being utilized and indeed, if we, in my opinion, if we try to argue that God can't do that, it would be placing a kind of limitation on God that you didn't find either in the biblical Old Testament, New Testament, or in the patristic era. Because as we're going to note as we go later, the way these texts were classically, some of them interpreted, a number of them we don't really have much interpretation, but the way a number of them are interpreted are to show, hey, we recognized in the patristic era that there was no issue in showing that elements could be changed. And indeed, we've got another incredible text here, and there are some fathers that hearken to this particular text, and it's in Wisdom chapter 19. And I'm going to go ahead and read it, and then I'd like to get you all's insight, because it's an incredible text. There's a lot of really meaty theology behind it. If you go to Wisdom 19, and I am reading from the Douay-Rheims version. I have a number of people that I know that probably have our book open. Somebody even sent me a message a little while ago that they're going to be following along from the book. In the book, you can follow along as well. We have this very passage in the book. And it's Wisdom 19. If you've got the Kindle edition, all you have to do is put search in the left-hand corner and you'll find it. And it reads, "For while the elements are changed in themselves, as in an instrument, the sound of the quality is changed. Yet all keep their sound, which may clearly be perceived by the very sight. For the things of the land were turned into the things of the water, and the things before swam in the water passed upon the land. The fire had power in water above its own virtue, and the water forgot its quenching nature. On the other side, the flames wasted not the flesh of corruptible animals walking therein, neither did they melt that good food, which was apt to melt as ice. For in all things thou didst magnify thy people, O Lord, and did honor them, and did not despise them, and did assist them in all times and every place." So a lot of stuff to really unpack there, as the early church did very often when they looked at these texts. And by the way, call me a little bit biased, but I kind of prefer the translation that we've got in our book, because we kind of break down in parentheses what is happening there and why this text is so important. Father, can you tell us what can we glean from these particular passages in Wisdom 19?
Yeah, Wisdom 19, once again, we're looking at a virtual commentary on select passages of the Old Testament. So let's think to ourselves in the first part, where it wants to use, of course, an analogy that the elements are a harmony like a psalter. Now, this tends to be assumed by us even in our atheistic material world of science. And I have taught philosophy of science in the past, so I'm always very interested in these sorts of things. And elements tend to cooperate with one another and tend to combine with one another. Of course, we think of molecules or alloys, and they seem to form a universe. They're beings that can interact with one another. We can interact with these elements, and they all seem to cooperate with one another, which is in and of itself suggestive, a harmony, that there is a harmonizer. And it's suggestive that there's a harmonizer. And what you'll see in modern apologetics is this is the starting point for what we would call the Clockmaker argument. If you start seeing a clock laying around the house, it's a good inference that there must have been a clockmaker. If you start seeing harmony in the universe, when everything could potentially be dead and lifeless and without energy, and all atoms scattered to the many winds of the universe, then, but it's not. Why is that? Because there's something else working that's harmonizing these things so that the universe is not dead. And that these kinds of arguments are what we would call intelligent design nowadays. But the second part, which is more important for our discussion of the Holy Eucharist, is where, at least in my translation, yours was a little bit different. The King James Version from 1611, which renders in very beautiful language, the same as the Douay Rheims, the same concepts. It says, "For earthly things were transmuted into watery, and the things that before swam in the water now went upon the ground." Do you notice that there's at least partially right there, there's a commentary on Genesis, that God took one kind of biological being, which was called a water being. We could say a fish or something. And now it goes upon the ground. Now, we shouldn't be reading Darwinian theories into this. This is trying to take modern scientific ideas and to root around and find them in the Bible, when we know that Darwin himself, I've read Origin of the Species. It's actually kind of an interesting book. And the kind of Christianity that he's fighting against is a rather ridiculous Christianity. I firmly believe that he was encountering Christians this way. But the rather interesting thing about the book is what I really learned after reading the entire book of Origin of the Species was a heck of a whole lot about breeding pigeons. So most of the book is dedicated to what happens when you breed pigeons in a certain way. So other than that, on a micro evolution, I think he makes a strong case for in his book. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about there's a watery natured thing. So we're going to call it being A. And it is changed into an earthly natured thing, B. So this is a claim that God can take one kind of being and make it into another being. He can take a dead being, meaning lifeless water, and he can transform it into, let's say, a sea creature. It's these exact examples in Genesis that the sacred author is giving us that are the very ground for us being able to say that transubstantiation is, or the Eucharistic change, is simply one more example of God doing what he always has from creation, through the Mosaic covenant, with the staff turning to a snake and water turning to blood. And then eventually in the New Testament, where we hear from John the Baptist that God can raise up out of stones in the desert around the Salt Sea, children. And so this kind of transformation is just standard. Then we see that fire had power in water. And I haven't actually looked up if this has a peculiar verse that it's referring to in the Old Testament. Do either of you have a sense what this might be referring to? Fire had power in water.
I am trying to think. You got me there. Gary, anything on your mind? When I think of fire, the first thing that I'm thinking of right now is the book of Malachi. But Father and Gary, you know that very well. It's because I've been studying a lot of stuff that deals with purgatory. But I'm really kind of running totally blanking out here. But I bet it is referring to something else. Gary, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, yeah, Father, you got me there too. I'm not quite sure.
Oh, that's all right. I don't know either. I should have done a little bit more preparation. Now, I do have a sense of where the other one is coming from. And water forgat its own quenching nature. Mm-hmm. And here I'm reminded of the three young men in the furnace.
Yes.
Which is as your title says, Apocrypha or Deuterocanonical, right? Mm-hmm. So here we have the men that are in the fire, the three young men that are in the furnace. And the fire forgot its own nature, and it was cool as dew in the furnace. And this was considered a standing miracle, where the three young men were not burned up. And they saw, of course, a fourth, which was like a son of man. So we're starting to see here that the Deuterocanon is very interested in how natural beings that were used to, let's say, uranium doing really bad things to us because it's, let's say, radioactive or something, being somehow miraculously prevented from its natural harmfulness by God, which is the idea of fire not being able to do what it normally does, and then water not being able to do what it normally does. And so the whole point here of wisdom, very much like the examples used in Exodus 4 and Exodus 7, for example, Moses' hand turning back and forth from dead flesh to live flesh, the serpent to a staff and a staff to a serpent, dust to gnats and gnats back into dust. All these kinds of transformations are entirely in line with the commentary that we get here in wisdom. But the most important part is what comes afterwards. So we've just talked about how natures, that is one kind of identified element A, or what kind of identified being A, is miraculously changed by God's direct intervention into something else. And we can think of the Genesis creation of creatures out of the waters. But then we see, neither melted they the icy kind of heavenly meat. What's your translation for that, William, in the Douay Rheims?
What verse is that?
That's going to look like 19.
Because I noticed, and I tried to, for the audience to know, I tried to find that beautiful translation. I couldn't find it in Bible Gateway.
Well, at least with mine, in the King James 1611 version, melted they the icy kind of heavenly meat. The Greek here of wisdom in which it's written is, it says that there is a crystalline kind of ambrosia food. Ambrosia we know from the Greek gods. It's a divine food. The food of angels is being compared, that is the manna, is being compared with ambrosia. So what the Greek translator here is doing, meaning that he has a Hebrew concept in his mind, but he's putting it in Greek terms, is that manna is like the divine ambrosia, which is actually the drink, I think. The nectar is the food of the gods. And so the crystalline is an ice. In Greek and Latin, crystal refers to the ice that forms from water. And so this icy kind of heavenly meat. What's really interesting is if you read Psalm 147, I think around verses 9 and 10, you'll find that there's a wordplay going on there where manna is called both morsels of bread, but the word bread in Greek and Hebrew can also mean flesh, morsels of flesh. But then the next lines tell us that when these morsels of bread or these morsels of flesh fell from heaven onto earth, that the sun could melt them. We learn in other places in the Old Testament, in the canonical, not the Deuterocanonical Old Testament. And what we see here is the commentary on wisdom is that this icy kind of heavenly meat, this ice meat, this snow, this hoarfrost, as it's sometimes called, when Moses experienced it, he thought that a sweet hoarfrost had fell on him, that this is what manna is, and that it melts. And so what we're starting to see is there's a comparison to ice, snow, and hail falling from heaven and manna, because there is a meteorological phenomenon, that is snow, ice, hail, that is formed in the clouds, that both in Near East, that is Semitic or Hebrew, Assyrian, Aramaic peoples, they think that some kind of really mysterious transformation is happening in those heavenly clouds. And so do the Greeks, because some of their science comes from the Near East. So we can imagine that some of their own ideas with regard to this may be able to be traced back to the Near East. And so what's happening here then is that we're learning a lot about the properties of manna, that on one hand, it's icy and solid, but on the other hand, it's meat, and it's even bloody in the book of Revelation. And so what we're starting to learn is that manna has this ill-defined nature. And I think Gary brought to my mind another aspect of manna that you'd mentioned right before the show. Did you want to bring that up, Gary?
Yeah. There's all sorts of interesting properties of the manna that wisdom points out. For example, the manna, like you said, melts when the sun is on it. That's why they could only gather manna each day, and then they had a double portion before the Sabbath. But in Numbers 11:8, we learned that manna could be pounded together into a paste and baked.
Mm.
And so it's interesting that, it has these weird properties where sunlight could melt it, and yet the Israelites could bake it as well, and it wouldn't melt.
Yeah, and there was an additional property, which is if you gathered more than one omer, and don't ask me how much an omer is. I've never bought an omer of anything that I'm aware of. But let's say that it's something like a kilogram. That's as mysterious to us Americans as an omer. So let's say it's about a kilogram, and you gather 2 kilograms other than Friday, and it gets eaten by worms, right? So that's the property. The other thing is that there's a quantitative miracle of the manna. No matter how much you gather, at the end of the day, you always have 1 omer, let's say 1 kilogram's worth, and you're never going to have more or less. So what we're starting to see is that whatever manna is, and Jesus identifying himself as manna, he wants to identify himself with a bread that has a quantitative miracle attached to it. It's a bread which apparently is used for baking, which is very interesting because, of course, this puts it in the realm of a rational food, like you and I prepare Eucharistic bread by baking, not just a heavenly food. It is called the food of angels in the Psalms because it falls from the place where the angels dwell in heaven, which is where the cloud, the thunders, the lightning, and ultimately the water mixes and becomes snow. And so it falls very much like snow and hail. And so it's compared to as water. If you were a kid and you did all those science experiments at school and you were fascinated by water evaporating and then recondensing it, then you would know that kind of process is, at least when I first experienced it, is rather enthralling. Well, the ancients were enthralled by it as well without modern meteorology, which is only about 100 years old. They had no way to explain what happens when that mist, we should call it steam, that comes off of hot water or evaporated water, let's say on the Nile, when it goes up into heaven. They knew that it went up into heaven in the ancient texts, but they didn't know how the fire, that is the lightning up there, and the cold made this water somehow become ice or snow or hail. And so that mystical process of it somehow being still watery, but at the same time almost this other kind of thing, ice, that was, they noticed that it expanded, it got larger in quantity, and yet it was the same amount of water somehow, whereas in its watery state, it looks like it's less, and in its crystalline state, it expands, its mass looks like it's bigger. And so all these properties are commented on by the ancients, and it's seen as a quantitative and even a substantial or transformative miracle. That's the reason why manna is presented in this way, is just like the quantitative miracle of no matter how much you gather, it weighs the same. So in a very similar way, the water is a mystery because it seems to have a lesser quantity in its liquid state than in its gaseous state than in its crystalline state. And so what we start seeing is the mysteries that surround water to ice. These are considered an appropriate analogy in the Bible, in the Greek fathers, in the Latin fathers, in the Syriac fathers, and ultimately in our own tradition of Jesus calling himself the manna that fell from heaven for the Eucharist. And so Wisdom 19 really represents the culmination of this by calling this heavenly food a crystalline kind of thing that falls from heaven like ice or snow. It's just building on Psalm 147, Psalm 148, and the references in the Pentateuch to the manna.
Really, really incredible points you bring up there, Father. And there's another particular area where I want to go to, and it's in the book of Sirach. Really amazing kind of languages that we find here, and we recognize that again, much more theological, meaty kind of stuff. Keeping in tune with the theme tonight, really, when we talk about the theme of just amazing kind of theology we can find in Sirach 43, and I want to unpack unpack it a little bit. And we're going to recognize how when you look at Sirach, and we'll go from Sirach, and we're going to see very familiar language in a proto-canonical book, the proto-canonical book of the book of Revelation. Surprisingly, there's something very familiar happening here. Sirach 43 reads, "The cold north wind bloweth, and the water is congealed into crystal." Yeah, I've got to say, I really do prefer the translation we have in our book, but nevertheless, we'll still be able to unpack it with this. "Congealed into crystal, upon every gathering together of waters, it shall rest, and shall close the waters as a breastplate." Then we go forward. We go to Sirach 43, 32 or 33, I believe. 30, let me begin 31. 30. "What shall we be able to do to glorify him? For the Almighty himself is above all his works. The Lord is terrible and exceeding great, and his power is admirable. Glorify the Lord as much as you ever can, as much as ever you can. For he will yet far exceed, and his magnificence is wonderful. Bless the Lord, exalt him as much as you can, for he is above all praise." Right now, a little while ago, we read about a description of frozen water, and we recognize that is very important, because that shows us that the physical laws, God's physical laws of nature, are brought out in a certain manner in the book of Sirach, and it really does kind of echo what we see in the book of Revelation, I believe chapter 3, 3:4 and 3:5, where we hear about hail and blood, I believe. Is that correct, Father?
Yeah. We do hear about hail. Did you see the words blood, though?
Let me look. Let me see. I could be wrong, and so we're doing this off the cuff. So let me look at it. Is it Revelation 3? I think it is Revelation 3.
In Revelation. I'm sorry, I heard you say Sirach.
Right. No. In Revelation. Yes. I think we do.
Yeah. We see that the large substance that falls from heaven, from the doors or the gates that are opened, which normally have the heavenly waters. We should remember that in the book of Revelation, when stuff is falling from heaven, it's falling from the clouds. We should also remember that before this stuff starts to fall, that the voice of the Lamb, or the voice of the Lord, or the voice of the saints is creating thunder and lightning. So we're supposed to be imagining a giant thunderstorm. And from the Lamb's side, there comes out water. That water immediately turns to ice. And then what's the next thing that happens? There is a reference early on to manna being received by John, but ultimately the stuff that falls from heaven is initially described as stars, which are white and like a falling star, which is, once again, is a motif that's very manna-like, particularly when the stuff that's falling is later described as yellowish 60-pound figs. Yellowish 60-pound figs, manna was both described as yellowish and whitish. And manna was compared to the products that come from the bdellium tree. The bdellium tree produces a yellowish fig-like fruit that looks just like the Asiatic fig that's growing in St. John's place of writing, which is near Ephesus. And so the Asiatic fig there looks very much like the bdellium tree fruit, which produces a product called manna. So it's very interesting. The manna that's produced from the bdellium tree is in Arabia, and it's little white crystals. These little white crystals, of course, look like little pieces of ice or snow. In the Bible, they're even compared to coriander seed, which I've never seen coriander seed, so until I started doing the research on this. But coriander seed is more yellowish than whitish, but it's about the same size and could be, at a distance, mistaken for bdellium or frankincense, or manna, as it's called, bdellium resin, frankincense, or manna. So all these things are mixed together. This idea in Revelation that what is falling from heaven is whitish, it's yellowish, it's white, it's burning in fire. Why? Because the bdellium plant's resin is incense, and it's lit and it's burnt as fire as well. So a lot of these images are very familiar to the readers. And but it's also odd in the book of Revelation that the stuff that's falling is bloody. This takes us back to Psalm 147, where the heavenly kind of meat, which melts as ice, is also flesh. And so we're starting to see that the manna comes as judgment to the evildoers in the book of Revelation, but it comes as a reward quite explicitly, where St. John himself receives manna. The other thing I'd like to say, though, about this passage in Sirach that you read is the origins. What is it a commentation and a continuation of? Job 38. Job chapter 38 speaks also, I believe, about the mystery of the rains, the snow, the hail. So, for example, in Job 38, I just pulled it up, verses 28 on down.
Mm-hmm.
Got it?
Yep, I got it open. Right
Feel
here in the
free to
screen.
read 28 maybe through till about 30.
Here we go. Who is the father of rain, or who begot the drops of dew? Out of whose womb came the ice, and the frost from heaven, who hath gendered it? The waters are hardened like a stone, and the surface of the deep is congealed.
Look at this fascination that the Bible has with water turning to ice.
Wow.
Not only is it because it's a meteorological phenomenon, I think in one of Gary's other interviews with us, I said, when I was a little kid, I was so fascinated when I saw my first snow that I remember. And I remember taking a bunch of it into the house and melting it because my dad had told me that when it melts, it becomes less. And they had this giant clump of snow and it just became this little puddle of water. And it just amazed me that quantity of snow could only yield so very little water. So we see that the mystery of how water changes and from one substance seemingly into another substance seemingly, and yet all the time is water, is considered a standard way to talk about substance to substance change, about mysterious changes that God does to the elements. And here in Job 38, we see that it uses, though poetically, it's Job saying something along the lines, does the rain have a father? Who has birthed or begotten the drops of dew? St. Thomas Aquinas recognizes what's going on here. This is an anticipation of the incarnation, but he wasn't the first one to. This is what all the fathers recognize. These verses here are an anticipation that Jesus, who came down from heaven, dropped down like heaven metaphorically or figuratively, like rain or hail or the manna. He came at the Father sent him from the cloud in heaven, his chariot throne in the heavens, that the father of this dew that dropped on the ground that was eaten by the Israelites, the bread that does not, though, lead to death, because Jesus says in John 6, your fathers ate this and they died, but I'm this new kind of manna that though I came down from heaven and I dropped down and you eat me, you're not going to die. And so who has begotten these drops of dew, which manna is sometimes compared to in the Old Testament in the canonical books? From whose womb comes the ice? Now we're seeing that ice is born from a womb. This looks very much like an anticipation of the manna that is born from the womb of a virgin. And the frost of heaven, who gives birth to it? Now, we know that this is poetic, but this is seen by the fathers as an anticipation of it. And then the waters harden like stone. So Job is fascinated with the transformation of water into ice. And the surface of the deep is frozen. And so here we see that idea of a breastplate in Sirach, right? That ice on water is like a breastplate that protects underneath the stuff that's soft, the stuff that is vulnerable. Here we see that there is a hardened surface and is frozen. These things are very natural phenomena, but they are used by the scriptural writers to help us understand that manna that Jesus is, that says my flesh is meat indeed and my blood is drink indeed, is using all these images of change that we see in our world to signify that whatever manna is, it's something that has these miraculous properties, that in some way it changes, but we can't quite understand how. And this is now starting to plumb the mystery of what the Eucharist is.
Really incredible there. Any thoughts on that, Gary? I'm just really in shock. I'll tell you why I'm in shock of one thing that I did not recall, but really I'm going to even probably tonight do some digging into is a Marian aspect, so we can find in there as well, out of whose womb came the ice. And you all know me very well. I'm going to dig and see what the fathers had to say there, but I know Father is right. The fathers viewed these passages in a very particular manner, and that manner was always the ancient biblical manner, which was Catholic. Gary, any thoughts so far on what's been unpacked? So really a ton of theological material, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's beautiful, Father, how you're interweaving all these different biblical themes together. The manna, the ice, the meat, the blood, the clouds giving birth. Yeah, boy, just tons of stuff. This is great.
Yeah, no, this is and I was really surprised at the writing of our book that Cyril of Jerusalem in his catechetical homilies uses all this and he just throws it all together. I thought that we had accomplished something by digging out and ferreting out all this stuff, and he throws it into just like one talk with his people. And of course, the talk is anticipating baptism and the reception of the Eucharist.
Yeah,
and he uses all of this stuff. I actually wondered if he was citing from the Book of Revelation, and because the Book of Revelation was not being used in the reading cycle in Jerusalem and in Byzantium, he probably needed to reduplicate it. So what he did is he selected, like Job, he selected all these passages that reflect eschatology, or the last things that are happening when the manna of judgment is falling on people, and the good are eating it, but the bad are getting crushed by it. And he actually finds all these sort of parallel passages and throws them together to talk about Jesus coming, both as manna and as judge. But he doesn't ever quote the Book of Revelation when he does this. He just finds all the parallel passages that Revelation's quoting from. But the thing that's quite clear is he also, as Philo the Jew, as Josephus, the first century great Jewish scholar, who is really quite impressive, they all see that there's some sort of substantial change that happens in their modern science when water becomes ice, when water transforms from one kind of substance into another. And yet, in the right conditions, you would be dubious whether or not you're looking at water or ice. One of the examples I use is if we're looking at a fish tank, you have to have a fish frozen in there that's not swimming around if you're at a distance to know that it's not water in that tank. You know there's something in that tank. And there's enough properties where you can recognize that ice is water and water is ice. And so the ancients were fascinated that it's still, in some sense, the same substance, but in some sense, not the same substance. And this is what we're saying with the Eucharist, isn't it? Mm-hmm. We're saying in some sense, it is bread and wine, but in some sense, it's no longer able accurately to be called bread and wine. And that is exactly the point that Jesus is making by calling himself manna to be eaten. This is exactly the point that Paul is making in 1 Corinthians 10, when he says that the manna that was eaten by the Jews is what we're celebrating in 1 Corinthians 11 on the night that the Lord supped, and he gave his bread broken for us and his blood poured out for us, is that he's giving us manna. And so what we see is that Cyril of Jerusalem is really just collecting as much data as he can put his hands on that's outside of the Book of Revelation to create the exact same scenario, that the meteorological phenomenon of white clouds with water turning into ice in them, just like the Book of Revelation and just like the 7th chapter of Daniel's prophecy, creates this snow. This snow falls. The snow is manna. It comes down in 60 pounders and crushes you when you're a bad person, and it comes down in little pebbles for you to eat when you're a good person. And this is all entirely consistent with what we're seeing in the Deuterocanon.
Yeah, that really is amazing there, and it really gets to the heart of the issue that we should not, when we reading the Bible, we should recognize the Deuterocanon flows very well for a particular reason. It's always been viewed as being biblical, always being viewed as being holy writ, as being prophetic. And you brought up a really good point there, Father, how when we look at the language being utilized in 1 Corinthians 10, follows over to 1 Corinthians 11, that sacrifice of the Lord, where we have the emphasis of not partaking in the table of demons. Well, we partake in the table of the Lord, where we have our Eucharistic sacrifice. But that language really ties in perfectly with Baruch 110. And by the way, we have Baruch right there in our book. You'll find it in there, and fitting in right there in the theme with true sacrifices, the altar of the Lord, the Thusiasterion of the Lord, Baruch 110. And they said, behold, we have sent you money, buy it with holocausts and frankincense, and make meat offerings and offerings for sin at the altar of the Lord our God. We recognize there are early fathers that look at that kind of language and they say, our altar of our God now is the table where we partake of that sacrifice, of that Eucharistic sacrifice. Is Baruch 110, is that also an important piece of biblical text as well, Father?
This is a great point that you've made. I've never made the association until you just said it now, William, which is Hebrews 13:10 says that we have an altar from which we partake, but he says a Thusiasterion, I think. And the Thusiasterion is the place where manna is offered. What is manna? Manna is the word that's used in Greek in Baruch to refer to frankincense. Now, most of us would be like, what? What's going on here? Manna was the common word that is referred to in Greek as meaning frankincense. Frankincense is just high-grade incense. Where does this high-grade incense come from? It comes from the bdellium tree. It's harvested twice a year by bleeding the sap, the resin, out of the tree. The Arabs made it. It was very rare, hard to get. The bdellium tree, I believe in Genesis 9, is the first plant named in the Bible. And you know that you're getting close to paradise, where the original paradise of Adam and Eve is, because the bdellium tree grows right next to it. So the tree that produces manna, the tree that produces frankincense, is the tree that is closest to paradise. What's also interesting about this tree is that it's guarded by legend. The Arabs like to hike up their prices, according to the ancients. And so they talked about all kinds of adventures that they had to have in order to get the frankincense, so that I guess they could demand top dollar. But it was dangerous to harvest it because there were what they called fire serpents or winged serpents on the bdellium tree. We know them as seraphs. Fiery serpents or fire serpent is translated as seraph. And I just read today in Josephus, who's writing in the 1st century, I believe it's in book 2, in chapter 12 of the Jewish Antiquities, that he even associates Moses with doing battle with the fire serpents in a passage that we did not mention in our book. So this is very interesting. But so the seraph or the fire serpent is the guardian of the manna. That's what symbolically is going on here. Is that seraphs guard manna, which is the resin that comes from the bdellium tree, which is next to paradise. So we can see in the Bible how all this stuff is commonly known, so that when we hear that manna is burnt on the incense altar, it's saying, yes, frankincense, but it has a double meaning, right? It's one word with two meanings, like the word bat. It means a stick that I hit a ball with, and it also means something that flies with wings. In the Old Testament, in Greek, which is what the New Testament writers are speaking and quoting from in Baruch, they see the word manna and they know that it has a double meaning. It refers to the bread that fell from heaven, but it also refers to frankincense. And Josephus says, as a 1st century Jew who is spending tons of time telling you what's going on in the temple, what all the accoutrements mean, what the vestments symbolize, when he describes the actual historical manna in Jewish antiquities, he describes the actual manna as tasting allegedly just like the bdellium frankincense. That's not coincidence. Why, of all things, does Josephus, the 1st century Jew, point out that manna is in some sense a spicy? He also sees the connection that we see in our book, which is that the manna that is sacrificed or burnt as a pleasing odor before God on the incense altar is symbolical, or is a reminder of the manna that fell from heaven. And that on the incense altar, the manna, which Jesus claims that he is the new incense, the pleasing sacrifice of Malachi 1:10 and 1:11, that he is the from the rising of the sun till its setting, he is the sweet smelling sacrifice that is offered to the Lord, that is bloodless, now in the Eucharist. And as that sweet smelling incense, or that frankincense burning before the Lord, he is like the frankincense tree. He's also the seraph of God, right? So he is the fiery serpent mounted on the pole, as in John's gospel in 2 different chapters, in which he compares himself to the serpent mounted on the pole. Why the serpent mounted on the pole? Well, it's called the fire serpent. What is the fire serpent? The fire serpent is the serpent that guards the manna. So he's associating himself also with the manna again in John's gospel by saying, I am the serpent that is known to you all, that is in the Arabian desert, where the Jews passed 40 years, which guards the manna of God. And we finally see that this fire serpent is only able to relinquish its manna to the harvesters by legend, which would have been known to the New Testament authors, like in the book of Revelation, is only able to relinquish its guardianship over the manna or the frankincense when you burn incense in front of it as an offering, so to speak. You smoke it out. And so what do we see with Hezekiah? Hezekiah notices that that incense is being burnt before the seraph in the temple, and he considers this Arabian superstition somehow to be giving divine worship to an artifact, and so he has it destroyed. We see this as all an anticipation of Jesus receiving the divine worship, but being destroyed, raising up, and then Hezekiah falls down as one dead for 3 days, and he rises up. This is all an anticipation of future things to come. So one little word in Baruch, manna, and all this meaning that is behind it.
Yeah. Yeah, Father, if I could tag on some to that
Sure.
too. As you're mentioning bread and frankincense and the offering, reminds me of the showbread offering in the holy place in the temple, where you have 12 loaves of freshly baked bread, and on top of it is bowls of incense, frankincense, which is said to be an anamnesis to the Lord, which is, one of the 6 times it's used in the Septuagint. Of course, the same word Jesus says when he says, do this in remembrance of me.
Wow, that's new to me. I'd never heard that before.
Yeah. And it's interesting because Scripture says of all the offerings, this is the most pleasing to God, is this showbread, the bread of the face.
Do you have any other details on in what way the incense and the bread play with each other? There may not be any details because it's oftentimes pithy in the Old Testament, but it'd be interesting to know if the scent of the incense is ever mentioned as in some way encompassing the bread.
Yeah, I would have to look at the instructions and how the bread is to be baked, because there is specific instructions. All I know for a fact that the cups of frankincense are on top of each column of the bread, which is very interesting because the bread is called the bread of the face, or the bread of the faces. It's also the bread of the offering. And what's interesting is it's not before the face of God. There's a curtain between the Holy of Holies and the holy place. So how does God know whether fresh bread has been placed there each Sabbath? And my theory is it's the frankincense, the smell of the frankincense is that offering where it's presented before the face of God. But I don't want to derail your whole discussion, but when you're mentioning that, I thought that's an interesting tie-in.
Yeah, no, this is new to me. I mean, it's always great to have these guests who don't normally spend time talking about these things with each other, because I get to learn things too. So yeah, no, I'm still plumbing the depths. Like I said, I'm just sharing with you what I read in Josephus today for the first time in my life.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
That really is amazing there about Josephus there, Father. I had not heard that before, but for the audience that may be wondering, a lot of things we've learned from each other tonight. This has been really incredible. This Baruch 110, I've learned the incredibly, shockingly similar language utilized in the book of Hebrews and what have you. And now I'm hearing about Josephus. Indeed, people that may be wondering, we're going to look at something else in Sirach, where I believe it was maybe a month after the book came out, where Father never stops doing research. He tells me I stumbled upon something else in there, and I guess really I hear it from Gary too. It's so common where after books come out, you're like, man, I should have included that. You keep finding stuff, isn't that right?
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them in particular that I found to be quite fascinating, and I wrote it down when we were having a discussion. It is in Sirach 24, and I don't even know if Father remembers. We were just talking about it, and I wrote it down. I think it's in Sirach 24. Where is it? It's where we've got the language. It's right here. Where is it? Maybe Gary can remember. Is where you have the text, the book of Sirach, where he's talking about. It's basically the words are so similar to the Eucharistic discourse.
Oh yeah, yeah. Sirach. Really quick. I believe it is. I have it highlighted in my Bible. Here we go. Yeah, it's the part where Jesus says, "For all that are hungry, come to me." That one.
I got it. Here it is. It's 29. I thought it was 21. So here we go.
Okay.
Here it is. Here we go. And I don't know why I wrote 21 down. I messed up there. It's 29. So here we go. They that eat me shall yet hunger, and they that drink me shall yet thirst. He that hearkeneth to me shall not be confounded, and they that work by me shall not sin. They that explain me shall have everlasting life, or life everlasting.
I do vaguely remember me bringing this to your attention.
You do remember it. Okay, you remember it. I remember you telling me you stumbled upon that, and I wrote it down. Indeed, every time, a lot of times, Father just stumbles upon stuff, and I write it down. And this is one of them. And the language, as people are listening, is shockingly similar.
And of course, when I'm giving that to you, I'm giving it to you because of the Greek translation.
That is correct.
Of Ben Sira, which looks a lot like Jesus's own words in Greek as they're translated by the whoever translated for the evangelists.
That is correct. Yes. In fact, 100% of the time, I'm usually talking to Father, and he'll be translated off the cuff from the Greek, and I'll be looking in the English. Because I'm about 150 years away from having that kind of skill, but but it's really incredible. John 6. Look at the language we've got here. Verse 35. And Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. He that comes to me shall not hunger, and he that believes in me shall never thirst. But I said unto you that you also have seen me and believe not." So we go onwards, and we recognize that the language is shockingly similar. Even when we go to verse 27, labor not for the meat which perishes, but for that which endures unto life everlasting. So we clearly have a parallelism there, but don't take it just from us. The great Augustine, in his sermon 366, also noted, and I want people to recognize the language utilized by Augustine, because it gets to the heart of what we're saying about the Deuterocanonical text. These are the pastors referred to when the shepherd turns and exclaims to the sheep, "Work for food that does not perish." It does not perish because the word of God remains forever. The word of the Lord is your food, indeed. Not only food, but also drink. What I highlighted there in the red are the words that you find in the Deuterocanonical text of Sirach. Thus, through the prophet, he addresses the people of old. However many partake of me will still be hungry, and however many drink of me will still have thirst. And referring directly to himself, he says the same thing. My flesh is real food. My blood is real drink. These pastures are found next to the water that recreates, and these pastures and water are found only in the Catholic Church. Here your pastures are found in the commandments of life. Here is found the fountain of water that flows to eternal life. Those streams will renew you when you come to be baptized in order to be restored in Christ. So we've got here in Augustine yet another connection, as we've been showing you all evening. We've been talking about the fathers. We've been talking about the Deuterocanon, the Protocanon, the New Testament, the patristic, Cyril of Jerusalem. Indeed, Father, I know what you're going to say, but it is no shock, is it, that Augustine saw this amazing connection?
No. In fact, what we found was in Augustine's De Trinitate, among other things, I want to say in his De Trinitate, it was either in book 2 or book 6, that he wanted to talk about substantial change from one kind of entity in the other, because some heretics were saying that the Holy Spirit can be substantially changed into some other being, let's say like a dove, and that would be a transubstantiation in contemporary language. In other words, Augustine, in his time, within a couple generations, there's a Greek father of the church by the name of Saint Leontius of Jerusalem that calls this exact kind of example by the word in Greek transubstantiation, metousiosis. So Augustine is talking clearly about something within about a generation or two of his own day, which is called transubstantiation. And he refers to change of these sorts of things in the greater context of the Eucharist, and then he compares it to water changing to ice. And so I think that your point with Augustine is that he sees many of the things that we are talking about in Sirach with regard to John 6, but he also sees all the other things that we see with John 6. We're not the ones that have found this out in our book, but we're the ones that have, in our own modern search engines, rediscovered what Augustine knew and reported piecemeal throughout his works. And he had to do it by memorizing the scriptures in Latin, going through the horrible, which he complains about, experience of reading one Latin translation, which was just as bad as the other one, and both of them were not the same. And then he had to go and find Greek, and his Greek wasn't great, but it wasn't bad. And so he would even go and try to get some knowledge about the Hebrew from reports when that was what would help him. And by sort of comparing all this stuff together, and even came up with a systematization of how to read and interpret the New Testament on Christian doctrine with regard to the languages, he nonetheless came to the exact same results that our book did, which is that things that we're reporting with Sirach, whether it be around 34 or here 21, are all Eucharistic style references.
Yeah, and incredible as well, but shouldn't, and your thoughts on this, Gary, in my opinion, it really shouldn't surprise us, because his father Ambrose taught the very same thing, and he very well, we find a lot of these themes that he gets from the great St. Ambrose in Augustine. So really, it shouldn't be surprising. The reason I pick on Gary is because you tune into Gary's great show, Hands-On Apologetics, he always deals with an early father at the beginning. What are your thoughts on that, Gary?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think Father's comments are spot on as well. By the way, you guys, you could have learned this through my case book, Case of the Deuterocanon. I had that reference in John 6 to Sirach.
Oh, yeah.
But nevertheless, it's awesome to get confirmation from your father.
Is this your classic book on the canon?
Well, it's one of them, I guess.
Okay, because I've read one of yours, and I just don't remember that quote. I wonder which one it was. It's the Why Catholic Bibles Are.
Okay, yeah. No, this is from the Case for the Deuterocanon. I go through and give these references, and that was one that came up, and it's very profound, because what Sirach's talking about is the Torah. You know, study the Torah, and the wisdom from the Torah will make you thirst for more wisdom. And Jesus takes that text and basically says that he's the living Torah. He's the source. So that when you come to him, you'll never hunger, you'll never thirst. And of course, that's a theme throughout the Gospel of John.
Well, of course, this reminds us too. Is it the Leviticus reference to man does not live by bread alone?
Oh yeah, yep.
Right. But from every word that comes from the mouth of God. I wonder to what extent that the verbal Torah that the Pharisees at least held to, that came from Mount Sinai, not the written Torah, comes from the mouth of God, and that in some sense Jesus is admitting that the Torah is initially verbal, not so much written, and that he is, so to speak, the law that came down verbally from Sinai, but that he can actually be consumed.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. There's all those tie-ins with, especially in John, with the word, the law, and the manna. That runs a lot through there, and and also you see this in the Deuterocanon too. Those same kind of threads where God's wisdom is food, very good.
Yeah, really incredible points there. And before we come close to wrapping it up, we do have one question from Lucas Pachiti. He wants to ask Father, do you believe that Wisdom 19:20 is referencing Elijah in the Mount Carmel from 1 Kings 18?
Oh, so 19:20. Why don't you read that verse for us?
Yeah, I'm pulling it up. Wisdom 19:20. Okay, here we go. On the other side, the flames wasted not the flesh of corruptible animals walking therein, neither did they melt that good food which was apt to melt as ice. For in all things thou did magnify the people, O Lord, and didst honor them, and did not despise them, but did assist them at all times and in every place.
And which one of those portions of the verse did you say his name was Lucas?
Yeah, Lucas is wondering if the Wisdom 19:20 is referencing Elijah in the Mount Carmel. Let me pull up 1 Kings.
Yeah, let's take a look at it. Try
1
to give a thorough answer to a specific question.
Here we go. Oops, 1 Kings 19. Okay, here we go. 1 Kings 19:19. And Elijah, departing from thence, found Eliseus, the son of Shaphat, plowing with 12 yoke of oxen. And he was one of them that were plowing with 12 yoke of oxen. And when Elijah came up to him, he cast his mantle upon him. He is wondering if Wisdom 19:19. Let me go back to
Go ahead and go back to 19 then and read that.
Yeah, Wisdom 19:19. The fire had power in water above its own virtue, and the water forgot its quenching nature. I don't see the
the 1 Kings 19. What's the verse on that one?
I believe he meant 1 Kings 18. Let me see. He didn't say what verse in 1 Kings. I am looking for it. We have Elijah appearing. Lucas, you got to tell us which verse in 1 Kings 18. 1 Kings 18 is quite lengthy, brother. It's it is 46 verses, and Elijah's name comes up 20 times. So if you can tell us.
I'm looking through it now to see if I can find in Greek any references to fire. Or to water. Yeah. This is the sacrifice, right?
Okay. The miracle, he says.
Yeah, ke pirmi epithetosan ke go pisovun. This is a good candidate, it sounds like. We do have the pure the fire and the water. This is a good this is a good explanation. So thanks for contributing. I mean, I think that there's something to be said for this. This could solve the mystery.
Very cool. And what verse was that, Father?
It looks like it starts at 1 Kings 18.
There we go.
21.
Okay. 21.
So there is the fire and the water contrast here. Now, what I don't remember is, does Sirach spend any other time on Elijah? I think he does, because he speaks about the ordination of Elijah to Elisha as being a handing on of the Holy Spirit. So I think that makes contextual sense as well, because Sirach does have some interest in Elijah's ministry of ordaining someone by the laying on of hands to receive the Holy Spirit.
Very nice catch
thanks.
there.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lucas.
That's awesome.
That is awesome. That's very, very nice. Any concluding thoughts, Gary? And then I'll go to give Father the last word before we wrap up. For my final thoughts, I'm just totally mind blown. Anytime, it's been a pleasure to literally kind of virtually sit down with you gentlemen and, just really kind of just pick at Father's brain and learn some new stuff and learn from you as well, Gary. It's been great. What are your thoughts? I've had a great time, Gary.
Yeah, same here. I mean, it's I feel like I deserve some sort of some credit or some things towards a elective course. Just listening to Father and you. I want to throw out like a little. Every time William's on my show, Father and everybody else, William always brings in a Deuterocanonical tie-in. So I thought I would give you an interesting tie-in to the liturgy. Because in Wisdom 16, verse 20, we were talking about the taste of the manna. And it said, instead of these things, you gave your people the food of angels, and without their toil, you supplied from heaven with bread ready to eat, providing every pleasure and suited in every taste. And that, by the way, folks, that is Wisdom 16:20, which is what we have for the benediction of the Eucharist, where the priest says, you've given us bread from heaven, and we respond having all sweetness within it. It actually comes from...
Actually, I had never made that connection before. Thanks, Gary.
Oh, cool. Right.
Wisdom 16:20 it is.
Yeah, and I'm looking at verse 22, Father. Look at that. For snow and ice endured the force of fire and melted not. Look at that they might know that fire burning in the hail and flashing in the rain destroyed the fruits of the enemies.
Yeah, and that's true for Sodom and Gomorrah. That's true for the meteorological phenomena, the storms in Daniel, which we're given an insight into the waters and the heavens there. That's true of the waters in Revelation. And even in the Psalms, this meteorological phenomenon is mentioned in several Psalms, most particularly Psalm 147 and Psalm 148. So I think that once we begin to understand how important, and I was only led to this because I just started to notice that Jewish first century authors like Philo and Josephus were using very technical and scientific vocabulary to talk about what's happening in those clouds with ice and snow in the context of manna. And I'm then starting to notice that the fathers of the church are doing this. And I'm like, this has to go back to something. And sure enough, other than Aristotle, who got all rationalistic on us, most of the other commentators that I'm finding that wanted to describe what's happening up there in the clouds are following this earlier meteorological theory, which is it's a substance to substance change. Nowadays, of course, we have a more restrictive sense of substance to substance change, and that means that we expect that the atomic and the molecular structure does not change, but that's not what they're working with. So we can't really say whether they're accurate or not. We don't consider a gaseous state, a liquid state, and a solid state to be a substantial difference by our definitions, because we have wed ourselves to a chart of elements. The ancients didn't necessarily hold for that. Some of them did, an analogous doctrine where elements could change into one another. But we have to realize that they are talking according to appearances. So one of the examples I think I've used on Gary's show, which is a very common one, and this would be kind of the last word, is this meteorological phenomenon. It's not accurate from the point of view of modern substance to substance change, and any more than it's accurate when you get up in the morning and you say, "Oh, what a beautiful sunrise." It's not a sunrise. Pick your theory. As long as you're not geocentrist, there's no rising sun. and yet you're allowed to talk according to appearances. Why? Because you're accurately describing what is seen by the eyes. And the meteorological phenomena that's being talked about in the Bible is not an explanation for how the natures change, because the natures change because of God's ordering or because of his miraculous intervention. In the heavenly clouds, it's because God somehow orders these things. In the staff to a serpent, it's because of miraculous intervention. And what we need to understand then is, even if by our standards the mystery of water turning to ice and into steam is not so profound anymore, since for 100 years now we've had a pretty darn good idea happening there, it is nonetheless true that we still talk in scientifically inaccurate language, but we talk in visibly or experientially accurate language when we say the sun rises, the sun sets, and various other things. We could go on and on and on of the things that we say that are scientifically, by today's standards, inaccurate, and yet none of us accuse each other of being erroneous people, because we're speaking in ways that all of us can identify with.
Yeah, that was fantastic. And Father, if you don't mind, we have one final question.
Sure.
It is from he's a great guy. His name is Matthew. He also does work in apologetics. Nice guy. He wants to know, did Jesus himself partake of his own body and blood at the Last Supper? I don't believe so, but I'm not sure. Can you help me out with that? Can you help him out with that?
I've not actually read a full study or done a full study on this question, but it seems to me that it says I want to go to one of the narratives, the Last Supper. The translation that I'm used to is he supped, he gave thanks, broke bread, gave it to his disciples, and said. It doesn't seem like it is saying that he consumed it. However, theologically, there's nothing wrong with him consuming his own body and blood, at least from the Franciscan perspective, which is one of the valid ways of looking at things, because Jesus also received baptism, though he had no sin. This is a sign that sacraments were not primarily invented in the divine order of things for sinners, but sacraments were actually invented for humans. So Adam and Eve would have had sacraments even if no sin had entered the world, because being flesh and blood embodied beings, they use symbols and signs to understand deeper realities. And so God would have instituted sacraments regardless. Now, the reason why this follows up is, if Jesus can take a sacrament, which John the Baptist clearly it's identified with repentance for sins, and he can transform the nature of his reception such that it's not for the forgiveness of sins, but to symbolically sanctify the elements, we can wonder if Jesus' own reception of the elements is in some sense to symbolize how sacred they are, that he has touched them with his own mouth or his own tongue or these sorts of things. But I've not seen a actual dissertation or an in-depth study on these sorts of things. I think we're free to speculate there, and I've never seen, for example, in Denzinger, any sort of treatment that would require us to believe that Jesus did or did not consume the gifts.
That was a great answer, Father, and thank you very much for your time, Father. Gary, thank you. For really providing incredible insight. I've had a great time, and Father, I know I speak for Gary as well when we say we look forward to having you back. I mean, this has been great.
Thanks. It was fun.
And before we wrap up, Father, anything that you're doing, your seminary, anything you're working on, anything? Do you have a page people can go to look at what is going on in your incredible world? Put a plug in before we wrap it up.
Well, I do have an academia.edu page, which you can just type my name in. Maybe for this show, you can post my Patreon.
Sure will.
But the things that we're working on, of course, you know very well, because you'll be contributing to this, but I've just got to finish out about 1.5 chapters on the papacy. And so, and I know Gary's had a sneak peek into some of the writing on that. Mind-blowing stuff. So if you've liked the Mary insights that William and I have worked on, and if you like the insights in the book, or attempted to explore more of the insights into the book on manna, that is the Eucharist and transubstantiation that we've put out, it's hard for me to say which book has the most discoveries in the sense of that are in print and modern English. You can root around and find these things in the fathers, and it's usually with a bunch of these and thous and forsooths in the free English translations on Google Books. But then to combine them all, and so I would say that I've been absolutely amazed at the stuff that we're finding on the papacy.
Yep.
And I really need to work on that in the Easter season, the Paschal tide here, so that we can put that out, because I think there's going to be some really mind-blowing themes that pop up there.
I totally agree, and I can't wait for that, for us to continue digging and finding more and more, as we always do. But as we come closer to that, I mean, even soon we will definitely have you back, Father. We've had an incredible time. Gary, I've had an incredible time. You all have yourself an amazing evening. And everybody, subscribe, like, and share, and go check out Father's material. Check out Gary's book. Check out the case for the Deuterocanon. Everything Gary is doing, check it out. Gary, I look forward to talking to you again soon, brother. And Father, have an incredible evening. We look forward to having you back.
Thanks very much.
All right.